Welcome back to the Northern Sentinels podcast. I'm your host, Chris Ayotte. On this episode, I speak with the CEO of Invictus Games Vancouver Whistler 2025, Scott Moore. Born in Montreal, but raised in Toronto, Scott grew up in a family where most were in the financial sector. This was not to be his path, and he focused on one of his passions, sports. Scott became one of Canada's most prominent sports broadcasters. He was one of the first employees at TSN in the 80s, helped start Sportsnet on CTV, ran CBC Sports, and eventually became the president of Sportsnet and NHL at Rogers Media. Scott came out of retirement to lead the organization and execution of Invictus 2025. The opening ceremony for the games is on 8 February, so I hope you take the time to not only listen to this episode and episode 23 with Invictus athlete Alaina Mundy, but to watch the games later this month. As always, thanks for your support. And now, here's my conversation with Scott Moore. Scott, thanks so much for joining me today on the Northern Sentinels podcast. And it's great to meet you virtually here.
Nice to meet you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
For the listener, Scott's calling in from Vancouver. He's the CEO of Invictus Games 25, and we'll get to that eventually in the podcast. But as the avid listener knows, we always start off with a little bit of family background and origin story. So why don't you tell us a little bit, Scott, about maybe where your family is originally from, if they're longtime Canadians, or if they came here from somewhere over the last 50, 100 years or so.
Well, my grandfather on my father's side moved to Canada from England in the, I think, early 1900s. And my mother's family, we're not sure. They're English for sure, but nobody seems to be able to tell me how far back they came to Canada. But my great-grandfather was a captain on a ship in the Great Lakes.
Okay.
And so there's a little tiny bit of merchant marine in there. And my parents had me in Montreal. That's why I'm a Montreal Canadiens fan. Although they moved me to Toronto when I was quite young, but I kept the Montreal Canadiens affiliation, despite the fact that I grew up in Toronto. So
you're still a fan.
I'm still a fan, and I joke when I used to run Hockey Night in Canada that I cheer for the Habs with my heart and cheer for the Leafs with my wallet. There must be some dangerous incidents. So you live in Vancouver right now. You're originally from Toronto, but you're a Habs fan. That's some dangerous waters to navigate to go back to your sort of family military heritage. Yeah, well, if people are familiar with Vancouver and the unifying force in all of Canada, which is to dislike Toronto, I always say that I am from Montreal, even though I only spent the first 6 years of my life in Montreal. And I gloss over the 40 years or so that I spent in Toronto.
And so how did your parents meet? How did the family come together?
My parents grew up in Toronto. I believe they met in university, and they first started dating when they were both working out in Alberta at the Banff Springs Hotel in the Shadow Lake Louise. And it's a favorite place of my family to go back to Alberta and to the Rockies. In fact, my parents do tell me that there was a better than even chance, maybe too much information, but that I was conceived at the Banff Springs Hotel, which explains why every time I stay there, I feel like leaving head first. So we as a family, we love the mountains, and my parents were very big on skiing, golf, tennis. And so I was lucky enough to grow up in a pretty sporting family. And that's what got me into wanting to be involved in sports as a career. The rest of my family are all in the financial business. And it took a long time, I think, for my father to understand exactly what I did. But when I was executive producing the Canadian Open at Glen Abbey one year, I invited him into the production truck, and he was quite impressed, because if you've ever been into a television production truck for golf or any sport, but particularly golf, it's controlled chaos. And he was pretty impressed that somehow out of that controlled chaos of 30 or 40 camera monitors and dozens of people running around, that we put out a coherent broadcast. And sadly, I lost my dad about a year and a half ago. He taught all of us in the family the value of giving back. He was a great philanthropist, especially later in his life. And when I agreed to take on the Invictus job, my wife, after I did one of the interviews, was a little upset. She was in tears. I said, "What's going on?" She said, "Well, normally when you'd have something like this going on in your life, you'd talk to your dad, and I think he'd be really pleased that you're taking on something that is giving back to a community that have given so much to us." So I think Dad would be happy with what we're doing with the Invictus Games.
Where do you think that he got that from, Scott? Like, what was the influence in his life? Because you had a great example, influenced you to take on this role. But I'm always curious as to what made your father and your mother that be meaningful to them.
Well, my dad would tell you that he was just incredibly lucky in his life. And interestingly, when I look at it in terms of service and military service, neither my father nor my grandfather were involved in the military, because just the way their generations ran. My grandfather would have been too old for World War II, and my father would have been too young for World War II. But we were brought up to have a real respect for the military. And my father believed he was just very lucky in his career. He did quite well in the financial business and made sure to give back. And it was always important to him, and made sure that message got to his kids and his grandkids. In fact, I was reminded of it over Thanksgiving, because the last Thanksgiving we had with Dad was a year and a half ago. And my wife taped or videotaped on the phone his speech. He always made at Grace just before Thanksgiving dinner. And there were a group of, I think, 30 of us, all kids, grandkids, great-grandkids. And he made sure that his message was to give back in some way, whether that's financially or with your time. So that's sort of the lingering message from my father. And I'd like to think that in a small way I'm living up to his example.
That's great to have that recorded.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if it might be too early to tell, but do you get a sense that younger generations in your family, that sort of advice and wisdom resonates with them?
I believe it does. I'm always impressed with we don't have kids, but we have lots of nieces and nephews, and going through high school at that age, they all were expected to put in public service hours, and so that message gets through. But we also, as a family, have a family foundation, so our donations get voted on and guided by my generation, and then also the generation below, which was really important to my father when he put the foundation together. That, I hope, instills that sort of service mentality in the next generation of our family.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, so you said your dad was in finance. What did your mom do?
Mom was a work-at-home mother, and I'm always amazed. And again, I mentioned we don't have kids, but always amazed that women of her generation brought up 3, 4 kids, or 4 in our family, without any help at home, right? And we were a difficult lot. My older brother and I, especially, we're not good with authority, and I think we probably were problem children for a while, just testing the limits of what we were able to do. And my father was traveling a lot back when I was an early teenager, so he left a lot of the discipline to my mom. And mom's still with us at 90, doing great.
So not a huge fan of authority as a kid. So what did you spend your time other than ignoring the rules?
Yeah, it translated into my later career too. Yeah, I spent a lot of time playing sports, hockey, tennis. I had a little stint with cricket in private school in Toronto. That didn't take, thank goodness. Rugby. Never played football though. But hockey was really my number one love. Was a real rink rat growing up. Played until I was 19 at not a very high level, let's be honest. And then one of the great experiences in my life was getting into coaching. I had a vice principal in high school who stopped me as I was coming down the hall and asked me what I was doing Saturday nights. And I told him I was partying because I was in grade 12. And he said, well, from here on in, you're coaching hockey, which is a great thing to do as a late teenager. And I did it into my late 20s. It's the best management training you can ever take. You can motivate a disparate group of 12 and 13-year-olds to play hockey well. You can do almost anything in management. I always used to joke when I introduced Don Cherry and Ron McLean that the best training I ever had about how to deal with on-air people was coaching 6-year-olds.
So, I mean, there's a bunch of rabbit holes we can go down to on that because we do tend to talk about leadership and mentorship a lot. But I am curious, and this isn't meant to be just sort of a flippant question because I am genuinely curious. You said your first love is hockey. What did you love about the sport?
Well, I think as a kid growing up in the 60s, that was the sport to play, right? There wasn't as much basketball, wasn't as much soccer. The local arena, which was the Montreal West Arena, where I first put on skates, and the North Toronto Arena, where I spent every hour of a weekend and a lot of time during the week, just became that center of the community and center of life in many ways. And much later on, when I was at CBC and then at Rogers, when we do Hockey Day in Canada across the country, you really get a sense. Sometimes I feel it was a disadvantage to grow up in a big city because when you go to the arenas in the smaller towns across Canada, you see how much that arena becomes the center of the community in so many ways. Now that's changing with the demographics of Canada, and hockey maybe not as much the national sport, and soccer and basketball is certainly growing. And I think will at some point, not in my lifetime, but in the next 50 years, soccer and basketball may overtake hockey as the predominant sport in Canada. But growing up, it was the hockey rink, and that was the center of my friend group. It was the center of my mentor group, former coaches I'm still in touch with, players that I coached I'm still in touch with. So it is sort of that nice string in your life that just continues on.
So I'll tell a brief story to get to a question. So I learned how to play hockey in Cold Lake, Alberta, in 1979. And before, we would always do sort of runs a couple times a year to Edmonton. And just by complete happenstance, I played right defense. By complete happenstance, we were in Sport Check to pick up some hockey gear on the way back, and the Oilers were coming in for a signing ceremony. So I had the chance to meet Paul Coffey.
Right.
So I'm now meeting Paul Coffey is someone, a kid in grade 2 or grade 3, is very different than an executive like you were. But I'm wondering, they often say, don't meet your heroes. I'm wondering if you had the opportunity to meet somebody who you had looked at as a young hockey player, and just whether it be just have a great interaction or even establish a relationship, and what that was like.
Yeah, there's two stories that come to mind on that. The first is as a 5-year-old, I was first introduced to Hockey Night in Canada, living in Montreal and watching the Montreal Canadiens. And those were the great Montreal Canadiens teams of the late 60s, early 70s. And Jean Beliveau, I always wore number 4 for Jean Beliveau when I was playing. And in fact, when I was a kid, I wrote to Jean Beliveau and he sent me a hockey card.
Really?
Many, many, many years later, as the head of CBC Sports, I met him somewhere, and I can't remember the first time I met him. Very brief, but the second time was at the NHL Awards, the first year that they were held in Las Vegas, and he was sitting in the row behind me. And for your viewers who may not remember Jean Beliveau, he was Gentleman Jean. That's what his nickname was. Tall, very good-looking man who just was senator later in life. And just a wonderful, wonderful guy. And I turned around and introduced myself again to him. And he said, "Yes, Scott, I remember. Nice to see you again," which I'm sure he said to everybody because, you might have met him along the way. But boy, I felt about 10 feet tall. And he didn't disappoint. One of the great people in hockey over the years. And seeing him not only play, but then later in life, seeing him sitting in the first or second row of the Forum during Montreal Canadiens games, he just was an amazing figure. And then the other one, I would think, Yvonne Portnoy, meeting him.
Okay.
We had dinner with him one time. During the NHL All-Star game that was being played in Montreal one year, we had a dinner with a group of clients, and we had Yvonne as our special guest. And somehow a mistake was made that I was sitting directly across from Yvonne. It should have been a client. But when I got there and saw my name there, I didn't change it because a good guy would have insisted that a client get to sit there. But I thought, no, I'm not giving him this chance. He got a chance to sit and listen to him for a long, long time. And years later, got a chance to do the same at a dinner at Michael Budman's house, the founder of Roots, sat across from Scotty Bowman.
Oh, yeah.
Boy, people will tell you who know me that I can talk. But when you sit across from somebody like Yvonne Conway or Scotty Bowman, the best thing to do is listen and maybe just throw in a question or two. And Scotty Bowman was telling unbelievable stories of when he used to coach the Habs, and they would take the train to Toronto or to Chicago. And the two teams would both be on the same train in different cars. They'd meet up in the bar car quite often.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the stories were amazing.
So you've already noted, Scott, that you were going to have a hockey career. And so did you have a sense when you were in high school about what you might want to do, maybe what you didn't want to do? Because you did mention that you weren't going to go into finance.
Yeah.
So what was the passion that you had in high school, and where did that take you?
Yeah, the passion in high school was that played hockey and did a little bit of acting in the school play. So I was either going to be a play-by-play man for hockey because I knew I wasn't going to make it as a player, an actor, a stand-up comic, or a foreign correspondent. And when I graduated from high school, there was a foreign correspondent by the name of Clark Todd who used to work for CTV News, who was unfortunately kidnapped and killed in the Middle East. And I thought, okay, that one's off the list. That's too dangerous.
Right. Yeah.
Stand-up comedy, I'm not really that funny. Acting seemed like a tough one. So play-by-play guy seemed the right thing to do. And a former hockey coach suggested I go to Ryerson College or Ryerson Institute at the time. Now it's Toronto Metropolitan University. That had the best radio and television arts program in the country. And so I went there, and as I graduated in 1984 was the launch of TSN, the first all-sports cable channel. They launched in September of 1984. I graduated in May of 1984. So I sent a number of resumes to Labatt, who owned the network at the time, and left a couple with my father to mail while I was backpacking in Europe. And years later, a guy by the name of Gordon Craig, who was a mentor and a great guy, he was the first president of TSN. He tells a great story that he got my resume stuffed inside a shoe with a note that said, "Now that I've got my foot in the door, or one foot in the door, I'd like to get the other foot in the door," which is a wonderful story. Sadly, not true. It may have happened, but it wasn't my resume, unless my father sent it that way, which is possible. But Gordon always tells that story, is that's how I got in to TSN in 1984.
You already sort of hinted that maybe your dad wasn't a super fan of this path, but so when you said, this is what I want to do, what did your folks think?
They were 100% behind me.
Okay.
I think one of the beauties of growing up in a very, very close, very loving family is they were 100% behind all of us in whatever we wanted to do. As I said, my father didn't quite understand it for a long time, but he was a big sports fan himself. So he enjoyed being taken to a couple of events once in a while. One of my favorites was taking him to Wimbledon one year. He was a huge tennis fan and huge player himself. And I think it was 2015. I was president of Sportsnet at the time, and we were the broadcasters of the Canadian Open, the Rogers Cup. And I was watching Wimbledon on a Thursday afternoon, and a Canadian girl got into the finals. Eugene Bouchard got into the finals. She won the semifinals. So I called my dad, who was up at our cottage, and I said, were you watching the tennis? He said, yeah, it was great. Are you going to come up and watch the finals with me? And I said, I got a better idea. Let's go. And he said, what? I said, well, let's go. Let's go to Wimbledon. Let's go to the finals. He said, well, how will we get there? I said, I'm guessing we'll have to fly. He said, how will we get tickets? I said, Dad, I'm kind of a big deal in sports. I can get tickets. As a matter of fact, I already have them. I've already called. I got the tickets. So we flew to London, went to Wimbledon, and Dad just had a great time. He'd never been to Wimbledon before. It's a top 5 bucket list sports event. Unfortunately, Eugenie Bouchard lost in the finals, and it wasn't a particularly long match, but we had a great time. And then the Sunday, instead of going to the men's final, because I didn't want to ask, I'm not good at asking for free tickets. I do it occasionally, but I didn't want to ask for tickets to the men's final. So I asked my dad, what do you want to do? And he said, I'd really like to go to St. Paul's Cathedral for service. Nice. He was a very religious guy. So we went to St. Paul's, and years later, he'd tell the story of how I flew into London to go to St. Paul's. And I said, Dad, you forgot. We really went for tennis. And then it all comes into a nice full circle that we were in London, my wife and I, just after my father died, and he'd seen our home. We've got a nice home in California, and he said there's a wall in the home that didn't have a piece of art on it. So he said, I'd love you to get a piece of art that reminds you of me. So we got a beautiful painting of St. Paul's Cathedral that is sitting there. And then the further circle round to that was in May of this year, we were at the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Invictus Games at St. Paul's Cathedral. Right. We were sitting right up near the pulpit with a relatively small group, a couple hundred people, including our patron of the games, Prince Harry, the Lord Mayor of London, a number of other people. And I just looked at my wife. I said, this is a surreal event to be here and to be in this company. And I know Dad would have loved it.
Those are just amazing moments. And I have to say, Scott, I mean, I love an origin story. But the fact that, back when you went to university, that your parents were supportive. They may not have understood, but they were supportive. I think that's a wonderful thing. That's such a great hallmark of closeness and love, because I think so many people struggle with that. I don't understand, so I can't support it if I don't understand. That's amazing.
Again, we don't have kids, but I think the greatest gift you can give your kid is to support them in whatever they want to do. But we have great friends whose kids want to be musicians. I can't think of a more difficult path. It's a tough business, and they support them. I know people whose kids want to be actors, or I don't think I know anyone who wants to be a comedian, but it is a great gift to be able to support them.
Now, so you said it was TSN. You were on the ground floor at TSN. So what's it like? What were your initial impressions of entering the industry on the ground floor of something brand new in Canada? And it's correct me if I'm wrong, is it a pretty regulated space because it's broadcasting?
It's very regulated.
Yeah.
I didn't know much about the regulation at the time. We were really pioneers back then. In 1984, there'd been an all sports channel in the US. ESPN started up 5 years before, but ESPN wasn't all that dominant. And when we started at TSN, we had some Blue Jay games, we had some tennis, we had Australian rules football, we had a lot of secondary sports, but we were all plucky. It was a very young group. I think I was employee 12 when we launched. We had 72 people on staff, and we were doing something that nobody in Canada had ever done. That's running a 24-hour sports channel. My job was to be the assignment editor or the lineup person for the nightly sports news program. There'd been a couple of half-hour highlight show programs done on television previous, Sportsline in Vancouver and Sports Page in Vancouver, Sportsline in Toronto. But it was a new genre. You couldn't get highlights, so we did a lot of crazy things just to fill the half hour. We had great mentors there. Gordon Craig, I've mentioned, a fellow by the name of John Wells, who was one of our first on-camera people, was a great mentor. And we created what 24-hour sports looked like. And it obviously evolved a lot since then. But one of the stories I like to tell is that I can remember maybe 2 weeks before we launched, the launch date was September 1st in 1984. We had a press conference in the studio, bunch of newspaper guys who came in and said, this will never work. Nobody's going to watch sports 24 hours a day. At the time, people thought it would be 6 months and dead. Well, look, 30 plus years later, 40 plus years later, there's 4 TSN channels, there's 5 Sportsnet channels. They're all thriving. Canadians have a thirst for sports and a thirst for stories about sports. So it was cool being on the ground floor of that. And then years later, I got to launch Sportsnet in a much more senior capacity. I was the head of production and operations at the time, so I had a greater impact on what it looked like when we launched. TSN, I thought I had a pretty good impact as a junior assignment guy, but it was really Gordon Craig and the folks above me that had the vision for it.
So did it feel, so despite the fact that people looked at it and said, this isn't going to last, did it feel like that? Like as a young guy, do you think, oh, this is kind of precarious? Like I don't know what's going to happen. Or did...
No, we were all confident. We all thought it would go great. You could feel momentum over time. I mean, remember, I still have somewhere a little plaque when we hit 100,000 subscribers, which is nothing now. TSN is into 11 million homes. But I remember saying to a fellow by the name of Jim Van Horn, who was one of our first on-camera people, when he would start to get recognized in the streets, because that was a bit of a hallmark for us when people started to understand who we were. But yeah, it was an exciting time. Cable television was really starting to explode. Many of your viewers are maybe not old enough, but TSN Much Music really started that cable trend in Canada. And TSN is still a juggernaut. Sportsnet, which came along about 12 years later, still a juggernaut. Media world has changed somewhat, but people still want to watch sports. It's sports and live news are the two most compelling forms of media in Canada and probably around the world.
No, why did you leave TSN?
Wanderlust. I had an opportunity to work for NBC at the Seoul Olympics in 1988, and that came out of working at the 88 Olympics in Calgary, which was TSN's first Olympics. I got a chance to really travel the world. Working for NBC was a dream. I was a big fan of their sports department at the time, and working at the Olympics in Seoul was was life-changing, really. That was the Olympics of Ben Johnson.
I was just going to ask,
yeah.
Did you see the 100?
That's a funny story. I can remember about four of us, we were covering weightlifting, and four of us were in the bar at the press village. The 100-meter, if I recall, was run in the morning because it was prime time in Eastern North America. So the night before, a bunch of us said, well, we should go over to the stadium and see if we can get in, because we just had credentials. We didn't have tickets. And I said, we're never getting in. And like an idiot, I did not go. And my three buddies went, and they stood right on the finish line. So they saw Ben Johnson cross the finish line. I do remember waking up 2 days later with my TV on in my hotel room and hearing the news that he had tested positive, and that changed the tone of the games, especially if you're Canadian, for the rest of the game. I've been lucky enough to do 11 Olympic Games over the years, all over the world, and that's what got me really intrigued in the power of sport to change lives. One of the things I can say about Olympians is I've rarely, if ever, met an Olympian who is not a great role model. But I've never seen sports change lives to the same extent that the Invictus Games save or change lives. And I quite often say, and maybe this is a segue into talking about the Invictus Games, but the Olympic Games change lives. The Invictus Games save lives. And both use sport as a transformative tool. But the beauty of using sport as therapy in the Invictus Games is it gives people a purpose again. It gives people a goal again. And only 15% of those who have participated in the Invictus Games over the last 10 years have said that without a purpose like the Invictus Games, they might otherwise have done harm to themselves. And I've got several stories, several examples of people that we've met who've said they've gotten their life back because of the Invictus Game, gotten their life back because of the purpose of sport and being able to be on a team again, to be able to wear your country's flag again, because these people who have served their country so well, who have been discharged either voluntarily or for medical reasons, don't get that chance to wear their country's flag on their sleeve. So it gives them that purpose again. And it's beautiful to see. We've heard from people who say, thank you for giving us our father back, or thank you for giving us our mother back, or thank you for giving us our son back. So that's a segue into what I've seen over the years of the power of sport. That bringing back to the Olympics, a young, not so young fellow anymore, but young fellow that I met through the Beijing Olympics out of Vancouver, who won 4 medals in various Olympic Games, including gold in kayak. He would tell you that without getting into kayaking as a young man, he probably would have gotten in trouble in his life. So sport has the ability to change lives. And that's what got me excited about the Invictus Games when I was asked to take over these games past January. That you see people's lives just totally changed and changed for the better.
There's a couple of things I'm interested in before we dive deep into Invictus. So I guess the first one is maybe a little bit about sort of you going to Sportsnet. I'm just curious, is what you learned leading up to going into that organization in terms of the industry, in terms of leadership that you carried forward into that next chapter?
Yeah, when I was asked to be a part of launching Sportsnet in 1997, we launched in 1998. I'd been in the business for 13, 14 years, had done a lot of different things, had led teams, and the chance to launch something, I've been lucky enough to be part of 5 different network launches over the years, but Sportsnet was probably the biggest. The excitement of starting something new, starting something fresh, being able to build your own team, that was really, really appealing. And to create something of scratch. And harkening back to the story about the launch of TSN, I can remember in 1998, people saying there's no room for a second sports channel. This nobody's going to carry it. Nobody's going to watch it. Well, we proved them wrong. I love being able to do something that proves people wrong. I was telling the story the other day about when we launched. I had to just come back from Los Angeles, seeing our friends and partial owners at Fox Sports. And on the way home, I was sitting on our flight on Air Canada, and I sketched out on the back of an Air Canada napkin what I wanted the studio for Sportsnet to look like. It was a pretty rough sketch. My drawing skills are not terrific, but I gave that to our set designer and our architects, and they built something that was way better than what I had originally envisioned. But they gave me this lovely gift that's still hanging in my office in Ontario, which is that Air Canada napkin and the rough drawings with pictures of the set being constructed and then finally going to air with, for no resemblance to my first drawing, although you could see bits and pieces of it, I guess. But being able to start something from scratch and using the vision of a team. And what I learned most in that time was, as a leader, if you've got people around you who are smarter, better at things than you are, and who are also more focused on certain things, you can give them an idea, and 99 times out of 100, if you've got the right people and you leave them alone, the idea will come back better executed than you thought it could be. So that's maybe the best advice I can tell young leaders is never be afraid to hire people who are going to challenge you. You've probably seen it in your career. You've seen it in the military. Your best leaders are those who empower you and allow you to do great work. The worst leaders are the ones who want to impose their ideas on everything, who don't trust you and don't want you to grow. The best leaders are leaders who want to see everybody who works with them grow their careers and get better and move along. The worst leaders are ones that want to hold them back.
Yeah, it's a great observation. I think one of the challenges the military faces on the leadership side is that you have moments where there really is no latitude for discussion. When you lead through these really complex environments, especially that are deeply laden in risk, you get a little bit of a tendency to default to that thing that becomes more authoritarian, which is appropriate at times. So you really have to, especially as you mature in your leadership styles, have this sort of ability to parse what makes sense when, noting that you still have to have some of these things that are more restrictive in your toolbox, but develop into the, like you said, having that ability to give folks the space, the resources to be their best selves and to do amazing things.
Yeah, I've not been in the military, but I think similar in some ways to working in live television, that you need to give people the space to be creative and problem solve when you've got that time and ability to do it. But when push comes to shove, when you're on the air live, or when you're in a heated environment as you would be in the military, at that time, there's not time for discussion. There's not time for debate. At that point, it's a top-down leadership style. And it's really interesting. And again, I'd love to have this chat with military leaders about, when you get to that point where the discussion and the debate and the planning is done, and you've got the best possible plans that everybody's put themselves into a part of, and then in execution, sometimes it has to be, okay, this is what we're doing. Everybody get on board. That's an interesting transition, and we're at the Invictus Games. We're at that moment where we're going from planning to execution. We're a little over 100 days away. Yeah, and so you have to get into that. I don't like to call it top down, but there are times that a decision just has to be made quickly, and that's sometimes the boss's job to do. ran into a former Canadian general early on in our I'm blanking on his last name. He used to be the president of Boeing too. Great guy. And I asked him his leadership advice, and he
talking about Al Meisinger, the new
his predecessor.
Before Al,
yeah,
okay.
Duff, and it will come to me as soon as we finish the webcast. His last name. I apologize to him if he's listening. But he had a very simple leadership rule: listen, learn, lead, in that order. Right?
Yeah. Your point about broadcast is, I mean, I mentioned risk and thinking about sort of physical risk in a lot of ways, but risk manifests in so many different forms. And as you were sort of at the start, Scott, talking about how you'd brought your dad into Glen Abbey into a broadcast truck. Mm-hmm. All I was thinking as you were describing it, this sounds like a command post.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Screens and so many things going on, and managing these and keeping everything where it needs to be. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of, I'll actually come back. I'll ask you another question, but then I'll come back to another parallel with sports to get your thoughts on it. But I guess my question before we sort of get into the Invictus road and veterans. So what was the impetus to leave broadcasting? Because I think you ended up down in California.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the transition?
I'd been at Rogers running Sportsnet and their sports properties and their broadcast properties for 8 years. And during that time, we went through a number of CEOs of Rogers. And when you have a new CEO, things change. And I was on, I think, my 5th CEO in 8 years. And frankly, I done what I wanted to do. We had taken Sportsnet from number 2 to TSN to a strong number 1. We tripled the revenue, we tripled the profits, and we were entering a stage where it was a more difficult time in the media world. And Rogers was looking at lessening their investment in the sports properties. And I said, you know what? I've had a really good run. It's time for me to move on, do something else. I was 58. My father had retired at 58. I thought this would be a good time to retire. And I tried. I'm not good at retiring.
Failed at retiring.
Yeah, failed at it. I ended up starting a production company with LeBron James and Maverick Carter, a Canadian version of it. And then as I did that for almost 5 years before the Invictus Games came going, and I was trying to ramp down my involvement in the production company. So I tell people this is my last gig. We'll see if that's true.
And so I heard this on a previous podcast, but what was the hook that got you to come up and take on this job?
Well, as I say, I knew the Invictus Games. I knew about them, but I did not have a military connection or a strong military connection. The only member of our family that was in the military is my Uncle Jack, who flew in World War II. And so when I was asked about it, I said, well, I can give you some other names. And they said, no, why don't you watch The Heart of Invictus on Netflix and tell us what you think?
Yeah.
Well, my wife and I watched the first episodes, I think 5 episodes. And after the first episode, we both had tears in our eyes, and we both said, okay, let's go get this job. And I think in my first interview with the board, I just leaned in and said, I want this job. Sometimes you know your purpose in life, and sometimes your purpose finds you. And I think this was a wonderful opportunity where a purpose found me, and it was the right time in my life. I mentioned the influence of my father and how he would have wanted me to do something like this. So it was great timing, and I knew a lot of the people who were on the board. They're good people. Their hearts are all in the right place. They want to do great things. And the Invictus Games, not only will we help change and save lives, but at the end of it, we're going to leave a financial legacy for veterans that will help finance Invictus Games for a number of years. That Canadian team will do things on veterans' homelessness, on veteran suicide issues, that being able to leave that financial legacy will be will be a wonderful thing to be able to say we did.
You've been around athletes for decades, and I'm wondering if you can draw some parallels between things like injuries, transition, loss of identity, between athletes who have, in some cases, been playing their sport since the time they can walk, and then at some point they leave the sport, whether by their own accord or being forced to. And I'm wondering if you've seen, in your experience being around so many athletes, especially from such a large number of sports, if you've seen those sort of parallels with people you've been exposed to in Invictus with veterans.
That's an interesting question. One of the things I was always struck by when I would meet athletes who had transitioned out, whether they were Olympic athletes or professional athletes, interestingly, I always tried to avoid athletes in their prime. I didn't want to be a hanger-on. I wouldn't try and make friends with them. My job was to cover them. So I got to know them usually in later parts of their career or as they transitioned out. And it's a struggle for most athletes, whether they're Olympians or whether they're pros, that your best, most productive, most high-profile times in your life are in your 20s and 30s, which is the reverse of most people's careers. You become more successful in your 40s, 50s, and sometimes 60s and even 70s, where a lot of these athletes then struggle for their purpose. And we talked about it already with veterans who have had to transition out of the forces, whether voluntarily or because of medical reasons, and they struggle for their purpose, right? And I can only imagine some of the things you as a member of the forces were part of, and the teamwork you were part of, and the experiences that you experienced, both good and bad. And there's an intensity to those experiences, the same as professional athletes or Olympians. And to have to transition on that and add into that you may have some physical issues or some mental issues, that the transition is far more challenging for somebody who's been a member of the forces and has been able to experience some of the great things, but also some of the challenging things. And we've seen a lot of Invictus athletes who have significant physical issues, and they're overcoming them in amazing ways. The story that I tell quite often is about a young man by the name of Mark Ormrod, who was a British Marine, served in Afghanistan, and he stepped on an IED and lost 2 legs and an arm. He competed in Sydney, and he competed in swimming. As the story goes, and there's video of this online, that as he dove in to start the race and the rest of the field went in, the rest of the field did the single lap in about 20, 30 seconds. Gold, silver, bronze all hit the wall, and they all turned around, and Mark Ormrod was about a third of the way down the pool. And the whole field turned and swam back, because in that culture, no man's left behind, and they all swam with Mark slowly to the finish line, and they all finished together. And that is a story that, to me, epitomizes what the Invictus Games are all about. And it's totally different than what you would see in an Olympics or Paralympics.
Yeah.
And it's not about who wins gold, silver, or bronze. It's about that camaraderie, regaining purpose, and teamwork. So that's what you get a chance to see if you're able to come to the games, if you're able to watch the games on television, or in Canada, you'll be able to see opening and closing ceremonies and highlights on CTV and TSN, my old friends at Bell Media. And there's magic in those moments that are unlike anything you will see in any other sporting event. In fact, one of the folks that work here, who I've worked with for a long time in sports, said this is sort of my my vacation from sports. It's not about sports. Sports is just a small part of what we're doing here. It's the vehicle. What the result is better mental health, better physical health, a regaining of purpose.
You've got a lot of experience around the Olympics, or a lot of experience around sports. And as you just said, this isn't really about the sports. I'm curious as to, what do you need to do differently? What do you need to put in place, whether it be for the event itself, whether it be the support for the team that's running it, that is different and maybe below the waterline? And I ask that because whether being in uniform or now out of uniform, I continue to have relationships and deal with people who are ill and injured, and it's not easy. There's a lot of care, compassion that's required, and I'm somebody who has been in that world.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a connection and there's a shared experience. So I'm just wondering, in terms of whether it be the actual games itself, some of the structures that need to be in place, not necessarily the physical structures, but that might be a case, or even just preparing the team for dealing with this onslaught of sort of ill and injured people coming from around the world.
Yeah, the biggest difference, and this is something that comes down from our patron Prince Harry, is every decision we make, we try to make with the participant and the competitor at the center of it. That this is more than the Olympics, more than the Paralympics. This is about them. And that's not a criticism of the Olympics or the Paralympics. Those are big businesses now. Those are spectacles. Those are huge international events. And quite often, while the competitors are important there, it can be about the sponsors, the crowd, the TV schedule. These games are about trying to make the experience as great as we can make it for the participants, so that they get the maximum amount out of it. And that's why we're all here. And I'll finish up with a story, because unfortunately I've got a meeting that I've got to go to, but I'll finish up with a story that puts it all in perspective for us. We have a young man by the name of Leland Mueller who works with us. He's an alumni of Team Canada from Team Dusseldorf, or from the Dusseldorf Games a year and a half ago. He joined us as an accessibility consultant, because Leland's in a wheelchair. Every Monday we have a meeting where the new members of the team introduce themselves, and Leland introduced himself this way. He said, "I joined the reserves when I was 16. I joined the Army full-time when I was out of high school, and a few years ago I had a catastrophic injury, and I knew immediately that I wasn't going to walk again. And within months, I knew that I didn't want to live this way. I fell into depression, and I didn't want to live." Leland got an opportunity to compete with Team Canada in Dusseldorf. He said that just being invited gave him purpose again. Training for it gave him purpose again. He went to the games, and as he said, I didn't win a single medal, but I got my life back. And then he looked at everybody in the room. There were about 60 of us who were on staff at the time, and he said, and I wanted to join this team because I wanted to remind all of you that what you're doing every day is saving lives. Pretty strong motivation. And it's a great way to frame what we're trying to do with the games. It's a great way to frame why we want people to come to the games, because not only will they be inspired by people like Leland, but they'll also be supporting them. We talk a lot about a legacy of gratitude. We want Canadians and people around the world, but because our games are in Canada, we want Canadians to reappreciate those who've served. And by being in the stands, by being at our opening ceremony on February 8th at BC Place, being one of hopefully 40,000 people who get to use a First Nations term, blanket people as they come in, competitors as they come into the stadium, and know that their service is appreciated. That's something special to be involved with. And Leland's words just continue to echo in my mind. We get a chance to save lives every day and change lives. So that's a great capper for me on what has been a very interesting career. But people ask me, what do you think of doing the Invictus Games? I said, it's the best thing I've ever done. And I haven't done it yet.
I'll be respectful of your time, Scott, because I could talk to you for another hour on this. But I want to thank you for coming out of your failed retirement to be the CEO of IG25. And I know that we'll have a lot of listeners who are going to be very keenly watching it to see, not just people they know, but people from around the world coming to Canada to either reinforce a purpose or find a new purpose. And I want to thank you for being on the show and being one of our Northern Sentinels.
Thank you very much, Chris. And just a last plug, people can go to invictusgames2025.ca. They can buy tickets as of next week. They can buy merchandise. They can donate to the games because we want to leave a minimum of $5 million in legacy. But most importantly, support the games and support these incredible competitors and these participants who have supported you behind the scenes for most of your life, and you may not have either recognized it or thanked them for it. And this is an opportunity to do both.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Chris, nice to see you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Scott. Please subscribe to The Greater Good on Substack to get this and other content to help you citizen better. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.